There is a word that outlived an empire, a word that, over 2,000 years after the last breath of the man who bore it, still sits in the mouths of kings, still echoes in the titles of nations. Kaiser, Tsar, both of them, nothing more than foreign tongues attempting to say the same name. Caesar, a name so potent, so deeply threaded into the fabric of civilization that humanity could not bring itself to let it go, could not bury it with the body, could not seal it in the tomb. That is where we begin, not at the battles, not at the blood, not at the famous words gasped in a marble hall on the Ides of March. We begin, instead, with a question that so rarely gets asked. Why him? Of all the brilliant, ambitious, ruthless men that Rome produced in that extraordinary century before the birth of Christ, why is it his name that endured? Why is it his story that still pulls at something deep in us, something that makes us want to understand, to follow, to listen? The answer, as it so often is with great historical figures, is not simple. It is layered. It is human. And it begins, as all human stories do, at the very beginning. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in July, the month that would one day bear his name, in the year 100 BC, into a Rome that was already cracking at its foundations. The Republic, that grand and ancient experiment in shared governance, was grinding against itself. Generals were becoming gods. The poor were restless. The rich were insatiable. And the Senate, that collection of toga-eyed men so convinced of their own permanence, could not yet see that the world they knew was already ending. Caesar's family, the gens Julia, claimed descent from Venus herself, from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, from the very gods who supposedly watched over Rome. It was, of course, the kind of claim that powerful families make. But there is something worth pausing on in the fact that young Gaius grew up in a household that genuinely believed it carried divine blood. That belief shapes a person. It shaped him, not into arrogance, though his enemies would certainly call it that, but into something more interesting, an unshakable sense of destiny, a quiet granite certainty that he was meant to matter. And yet, in his early years, mattering was not guaranteed. His father died when Caesar was 15, suddenly, without warning, stooping to put on a sandal one morning and simply never rising again. The family was not wealthy by the standards of the Roman elite. His aunt, Julia, was married to the great general Marius, which placed young Caesar in the orbit of power, but also placed him in the crosshairs of Marius's enemy, the cold and calculating dictator Sulla. When Sulla marched on Rome and began his purges, Caesar was listed, marked, a teenager, barely a man, suddenly with a price on his survival. He fled, he hid, he bargained and moved through shadows. And here, right here, we see the first flicker of the thing that would define him, his entire life. Caesar, cornered and young and afraid, did not collapse. He negotiated. He sent intermediaries. He charmed those close to Sulla into pleading his case. And when Sulla, who was not a man known for mercy, finally relented and removed his name from the list, the old dictator is said to have issued a warning to those who had intervened on the boy's behalf. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. Sulla saw it then, even at the very beginning. Caesar was not one thing. He was not simply a soldier, though he would become one of the greatest commanders the ancient world ever produced. He was not simply a politician, though he would bend and ultimately break the Roman constitution. He was not simply a writer, though his accounts of his own campaigns remain among the most readable military memoirs in history. He was all of these things, simultaneously, without apparent contradiction. He could charm a crowd of 10,000 and charm a single man across a dinner table with equal ease. He could be extravagantly generous and ruthlessly cold within the same afternoon. He believed, truly, deeply believed, that Rome was only as great as the man willing to carry it, that the Republic was not a sacred thing but a tool, and that tools, when they no longer serve their purpose, ought to be remade. That belief would drive everything. It would carry him across the Rhine and into the grey mists of Britannia. It would take him to Egypt and to Cleopatra. It would carry him through civil war, through triumph, through dictatorship. And it would, on a bright March morning, carry him into a Senate chamber from which he would not walk out. But we are not there yet. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from being expected to be great. Not the pressure of a taskmaster standing over you, not the sharp sting of a disappointed parent's words, but something quieter and more persistent than either of those things. The pressure of a name, the pressure of a bloodline that has whispered, "You are different," into your ear, since before you could fully understand what different meant. Julius Caesar grew up inside that pressure the way a stone grows inside a riverbed, shaped by it, smoothed by it, made harder and more precise by the constant, invisible force of it pressing in from every direction. Rome in the 1st century BC was a city that ate its young. Not literally, of course, though the politics of the era came close enough at times that the distinction felt academic. It was a city of roughly 1 million people, dense and loud and stratified in ways that a modern mind struggles to fully absorb. At the top, the old patrician families, draped in tradition and privilege, governing through the Senate. Below them, the wealthy equestrians, merchants, landowners, men of business, and beneath all of that, the vast and churning mass of ordinary Romans, the plebs, who were free in principle and precarious in practice. Caesar's family existed in an uncomfortable middle space, patrician by blood, but not wealthy enough to move through the upper echelons of Roman society with any real ease. They had the name, they did not always have the means to match it. His formal education began early, as it did for all boys of his class, and it was conducted with the thoroughness that Rome demanded of those it intended to use. He studied Greek, not merely as a courtesy language, but as a living intellectual tradition. He read Homer and Thucydides and Plato. He absorbed rhetoric, that supreme Roman art, the ability to stand before an audience and move them not by force, but by the careful architecture of words. His teacher in rhetoric was Marcus Antonius Nifo, a man of considerable reputation, and Caesar proved to be one of those rare students who does not simply learn from a great teacher, but absorbs something deeper, the philosophy behind the technique, the understanding of why certain words land and others fall away into silence. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional student, extraordinarily quick, possessed of a memory that contemporaries described with something approaching awe. The ability to dictate to multiple secretaries simultaneously on entirely different subjects, to read and write and think at a pace that left those around him slightly breathless. Cicero, who was no friend to Caesar in the political sense, and had every reason to diminish him, nonetheless once wrote that Caesar had the finest and most natural command of Latin he had ever encountered. That was not a compliment Cicero handed out carelessly. It meant something. But education in Rome was never purely academic. It was preparation for public life, for the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that an ambitious Roman was expected to climb in sequence. Quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul, each rung higher than the last, each one more expensive, more politically treacherous, more demanding of the networks and alliances that only years of careful cultivation could build. Caesar understood this ladder from boyhood. He understood that intelligence alone would not carry him up it. He would need money. He would need allies. He would need, above all, popularity. That peculiar Roman currency that could be earned in the law courts, in the arena, in the distribution of grain and the sponsorship of public games, and the 10,000 small acts of generosity that built a reputation in the streets of Rome where votes were actually won. The trouble was the money. After his father's death, and the turbulent years of Sulla's dictatorship, Caesar found himself in a position that would have paralyzed a lesser man. And that, in a fascinating and very revealing way, Caesar turned almost immediately into a kind of strategic asset. He began borrowing, not small amounts, not the careful, cautious borrowing of a man trying to manage a deficit. He borrowed on a scale that was, frankly, staggering. At various points in his early career, his debts reached figures that modern historians estimate in the hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary terms. He owed money to half of Rome's financial class. He owed money to men who had every reason to want him to succeed simply because their own fortunes were now tangled up in his. His principal creditor was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Roman world, a figure whose wealth was so vast that he once casually remarked, "A man could not truly be called rich unless he could fund an army from his own pocket." Crassus was not a sentimental investor. He did not lend to Caesar out of affection. He lent to Caesar because he recognized in this quick, charming, relentlessly energetic young man something that money alone could never manufacture: genuine political talent, the kind that moves crowds and wins loyalty and creates, from thin air, the impression of inevitability. Crassus bought a stake in that talent, and Caesar, who understood the transaction completely, accepted the terms without apparent embarrassment. This is worth pausing on, because the absence of embarrassment tells us something essential about who Caesar was. Most men buried under debt of that magnitude would carry it as a private shame, would shrink slightly in social situations, would adopt the particular hunched quality of those who owe more than they can comfortably face. Caesar did none of this. He carried his debt the way a king carries a crown, as though it was simply part of the costume that the role required. He continued to spend lavishly. He threw parties. He gave gifts. When he served as aedile in 65 BC, the magistrate responsible for public buildings and games, he put on a spectacle of such extraordinary extravagance that Rome simply stopped and stared. 320 pairs of gladiators fought in silver armor. The city had never seen anything like it. The crowd loved him with the uncomplicated, thunderous love that crowds reserve for those who make them feel, if only for an afternoon, that life is larger and more magnificent than it usually seems. That love was not incidental. It was the plan. He was also, during these same years, working the law courts with a ferocity that surprised even those who knew him well. He took cases, prosecutions of corrupt governors, men who had abused their provincial posts in ways that Romans found genuinely offensive, and he argued them with a passion and precision that drew audiences. Roman trials were public spectacles in the truest sense. The forum would fill. People would stand on the edges of the space and listen, the way people today might gather around a street performer who has genuine talent. Caesar gave them their money's worth. He lost some of these cases. The political realities of Rome meant that well-connected defendants rarely suffered the full weight of the law, but even in losing, he made his name. He demonstrated, in case after case, that here was a man who was not afraid, who would stand in a public space and accuse powerful men of wrongdoing without flinching. Rome noticed. Rome always noticed. In between these years of debt and spectacle and legal combat, Caesar traveled. He had gone east as a young man to study rhetoric in Rhodes, a journey that became unexpectedly dramatic when his ship was seized by pirates off the coast of Asia Minor. The pirates held him for ransom. They asked for 20 talents of silver. Caesar, by all accounts, laughed at them. He told them they had profoundly underestimated his value and insisted they demand 50. He then proceeded to spend his weeks in captivity, writing poetry, practicing his speeches, and cheerfully informing his captors. With a warmth that apparently unsettled them, that once the ransom was paid and he was free, he would return and have them all crucified. They laughed. They assumed he was joking. He was not joking. The ransom was paid. Caesar raised ships from the nearest coastal cities, returned to the pirate anchorage, captured nearly the entire band, and crucified them as promised. Though, and this detail says something precise about the mixture of ruthlessness and pragmatism that ran through everything he did. He had their throats cut first, as a mercy, before they were placed on the crosses. He had told them he would crucify them. He did not specify they would be alive when it happened. He kept his word. He simply interpreted it generously. That same combination, iron will wrapped in something that felt almost like kindness, would surface again and again throughout his life. He was not, or at least not straightforwardly, a cruel man. He practiced what he himself called clementia. Clemency, the deliberate choice of mercy over punishment in cases where punishment was within his power. His enemies, when he defeated them in civil war, were frequently pardoned, returned to their estates, sometimes even restored to political life. This was not purely noble instinct, it was also brilliant strategy. Every pardoned enemy became a walking advertisement for his magnanimity, and magnanimity, in Rome, was a quality associated with kings, but there was always that edge beneath it, that pirate crucifying, dice-rolling, river-crossing edge that meant no one who dealt with Julius Caesar could ever quite afford to be comfortable. By his mid-30s, the shape of the man was clear. He was tall. Roman sources consistently note his height, which was unusual in that world. He was lean, not particularly imposing in the physical sense, and deeply self-conscious about his receding hairline, a vulnerability that his enemies mocked, and that he addressed with arrangements of his remaining hair that ancient writers describe with barely concealed amusement. He dressed carefully, almost elaborately, in the Roman fashion, wearing his belt loosely in a style that the conservative Sulla had apparently also noticed and commented upon, as though even the drape of a toga could reveal something about a man's relationship to convention. He did not sleep much. He ate simply. He drank almost nothing. At banquets, he would lift his cup and rarely drain it, a self-discipline in an age of spectacular excess that contemporaries remarked upon. But he was, all witnesses agreed, an extraordinary conversationalist. He was funny, genuinely, naturally funny. His wit was quick and dry and occasionally merciless, and in a culture that prized verbal cleverness, that gift opened rooms that money could not. He was also, by this point in his life, beginning to see what he wanted. Not merely success, not merely wealth, though wealth was necessary. He was beginning to see, with the patient, long-sighted clarity of a man who has already survived poverty, exile, pirates, and dictatorship, the shape of what Rome could become. And what Rome could become, in the vision that was forming behind those sharp, dark eyes, looked very much like something built around a single extraordinary man. He was not yet powerful enough to say it aloud, but he was getting there. Power, in the Roman Republic, was not something you took. It was something you were given, carefully, grudgingly, through a system of offices and elections and senatorial approvals that had been designed, with considerable deliberateness, to ensure that no single man could accumulate too much of it at once. The Romans had invented this system because they had lived under kings, and they had not forgotten what kings did. The memory of Tarquinius Superbus, the last Roman king, expelled from the city in 509 BC after a reign of calculated brutality, still lived in the Roman political imagination, like an old scar that aches before the rain. The Republic had been built as a permanent answer to that memory. 2 consuls, elected annually, so that neither could reign too long. A senate to advise and constrain. Tribunes to protect the people. Checks upon checks upon checks. an intricate architecture of mutual limitation, the Romans' great political gift to the world. Caesar understood this system with the intimacy of a man who had studied it his entire life, and the detachment of a man who had already begun, quietly and without announcing it, to think beyond it. He entered public office the way a skilled musician enters a room, aware of the acoustics, adjusting instinctively, already thinking 3 movements ahead. His first significant post, the quaestorship in 69 BC, came with a personal grief attached to it. His aunt Julia died that year, the widow of the great Marius, and Caesar delivered her funeral oration in the Forum in a manner that struck the crowd as unexpectedly bold. He displayed the funeral masks of Marius at the ceremony, the first time they had been publicly shown since Sulla had declared Marius an enemy of the state. It was a political statement wrapped in mourning clothes. It was a signal sent to the population of Rome, and particularly to the hundreds of thousands who still remembered Marius as a champion of the common people, that Caesar was not a man of the old establishment, that he was something else. The crowd's response told him what he needed to know. He would use that signal again and again in different forms throughout his ascent. He was patrician by birth, but popular by strategy, a combination that made the senatorial class profoundly uneasy in ways they could never quite articulate. He was one of them, and not one of them, simultaneously, and that ambiguity was not accidental. He cultivated it the way a gardener cultivates a particular plant, patiently, attentively, understanding that it needed exactly the right conditions to produce what he intended. His election as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC was the moment that made Rome blink. The Pontifex Maximus was the chief priest of Rome, not a religious position in the way that a modern mind might imagine, but a political and symbolic post of enormous prestige, one that came with a public residence in the heart of Rome, on the sacred way, and with an authority over religious ceremony that gave its holder a kind of soft power over the rhythms of Roman public life. The position was held for life. The men who typically competed for it were elder statesmen, men of accumulated dignity and established standing. Caesar was in his late 30s, still building his career, still carrying his extraordinary debts, and he ran for it anyway, against 2 of the most respected men in the Senate. On the morning of the election, he told his mother, as she saw him off at the door, that he would come home Pontifex Maximus or not come home at all. He was not speaking literally, but the dramatic clarity of the statement tells you something about how completely he had already committed himself to a version of the future in which failure was simply not a narrative he was willing to inhabit. He won decisively. The Senate noticed. The Senate was alarmed. And the Senate, because it was populated by men who were proud, conservative, and deeply reluctant to admit that they were watching something historically unusual take shape in front of them, responded with the particular blindness of institutions that mistake their own permanence for a law of nature. They underestimated him. They would keep underestimating him. And that persistent underestimation was, in its way, one of the great gifts of Caesar's career, because it bought him time. It was around this period that the shape of what historians would later call the First Triumvirate began to emerge. The word triumvirate suggests something formal, something declared and structured, but the reality was far more intimate and practical than that. It was, at its core, a private agreement between 3 men who had separately concluded that Rome's political machinery could not give them what they needed individually, but that together they might be able to reshape the terms entirely. The 3 men were Caesar, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. It is worth taking a moment with Pompey, because he is one of the most fascinating figures in this story, and he is frequently flattened by history into the role of Caesar's rival and eventual victim in a way that does him a disservice. Pompey, in the year 60 BC, was arguably the most celebrated man in Rome. He had conquered the eastern Mediterranean. He had cleared the sea lanes of pirates, an extraordinary logistical feat that had made the entire Roman world safer and more prosperous. He had reorganized the eastern provinces with a thoroughness that would shape the region for generations. He had celebrated triumphs so elaborate, so staggeringly expensive, that Rome had run out of adequate adjectives to describe them. He was tall and physically impressive, possessed of a particular charisma that expressed itself not in words but in presence. The sheer, gravity-bending weight of being Pompey the Great in a room. And yet, in 60 BC, Pompey was frustrated. He had returned from his eastern campaigns, expecting the Senate to ratify his arrangements and provide his veterans with the land grants they had been promised. The Senate, jealous of his extraordinary prestige, had delayed and obstructed and offered up the particular kind of passive institutional resistance that bureaucracies deploy when they want to diminish someone without openly confronting them. Pompey was a magnificent commander. He was not a skilled politician. He did not enjoy the grinding, personal, relationship-by-relationship work of the forum. He was the sort of man who was accustomed to problems that could be solved by the movement of legions, and the Senate was presenting him with a problem that required a different kind of force entirely. Caesar recognized this. Caesar also recognized that Crassus, still the wealthiest man in Rome, had his own grievances with the Senate, specifically around tax farming contracts in the eastern provinces that he had been trying, unsuccessfully, to renegotiate. Crassus and Pompey detested each other personally, in the way that two enormously powerful men, who have been rivals for decades, tend to detest each other, with the full-bodied, professionally maintained animosity of those who have never quite found the moment to finish the argument. Caesar introduced them to each other in private and suggested that their mutual interests might outweigh their mutual loathing. He proposed the arrangement with the calm of a man who has been rehearsing the conversation in his head for some time. Pompey would get his land reforms, Crassus would get his tax concessions, and Caesar would get the consulship, which he was already positioned to win, and after that, something he'd been thinking about for years, something specific, something that, to a casual observer, might have looked less like an opportunity and more like an assignment no sensible man would want. He wanted the command in Gaul. To understand why, it helps to look at what Gaul was in 60 BC. It was not a province, not in the tidy Roman sense. It was a vast and complicated territory, what is today France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany, populated by hundreds of Celtic tribes of varying sizes and allegiances and temperaments, loosely organized, frequently in conflict with one another, and largely outside the Roman administrative world. Roman territory in the region was limited to the south, to what the Romans called Gallia Nairobiensis. Provence, essentially, the Mediterranean strip that Rome had held for decades. Beyond that lay what the Romans called Gallia Comita, long-haired Gaul, a description that was partly geographical and partly a comment on how the Romans viewed the people who lived there. What Caesar saw in Gaul was not what his contemporaries saw. They saw a difficult, expensive, geographically inconvenient tangle of tribal politics at the edge of the civilized world. Caesar saw a theater, a stage, a place where a man of sufficient vision and audacity could win the kind of military glory that translated, in Rome, directly into political currency. He needed military credibility. He had been an administrator, a priest, a lawyer, a politician of the first order, but he had not yet commanded a great army in a great campaign, and in Rome, that absence was a ceiling. A man without military glory could go very far. A man with it could go anywhere. He also saw, and this speaks to the reach of his strategic imagination, that the conquest of Gaul would produce something else entirely: money, enormous quantities of it, the kind that comes from plunder and tribute, and the economic integration of new territories into the Roman system. He needed to pay his debts. He needed to fund future campaigns. He needed, in the bluntest terms, to turn a military command into a financial engine that would bankroll everything that came after. Gaul could do all of that, if he was the right man, if he moved quickly enough, if he was willing to be more aggressive, more far-sighted, and more prepared to improvise in the field than any Roman commander before him had been. He was willing. The consulship of 59 BC was Caesar's first, and the way he conducted it was a preview, in miniature, of everything that would follow. He pushed through the land reforms for Pompey's veterans over the Senate's objections by simply taking the legislation directly to the popular assembly, bypassing the Senate's blocking tactics in a way that was technically legal and constitutionally outrageous. When his co-consul, Bibulus, tried to obstruct the proceedings by declaring the omens unfavorable, a genuine procedural mechanism in Roman governance, and one that had been used to stall legislation for generations, Caesar had him physically removed from the forum by supporters in the crowd. Bibulus retreated to his house and spent the remaining months of the year there, issuing proclamations that declared all legislation invalid. Rome ignored him. The laws passed anyway. The Senate was furious. Cicero, watching from the sidelines, described the consulship with the pained precision of a man witnessing something he had always feared and half expected. Others used stronger language. But by the time the political temperature of Rome had risen to the point where serious action against Caesar might have been taken, Caesar was already gone. His command in Gaul had been arranged. His legions were waiting. He rode north in the early spring of 58 BC, and as the city walls of Rome dropped behind him and the road opened up through the Italian countryside, everything that had come before, the debts, the elections, the trials, the backroom agreements, the years of patient, grinding preparation, all of it had been, in its way, a prologue. The real story was beginning now. The story that would be told by the movement of armies and the fall of cities and the crossing of rivers whose names would become permanently attached to one man's extraordinary, irreversible ambition. He was 42 years old. He had never commanded an army, and he was riding toward one of the most astonishing military campaigns in the history of the ancient world. There is a particular silence that falls over a landscape before an army moves through it. The birds feel it first, then the animals in the field, and then, if you were standing on a hillside in what is now southern France in the spring of 58 BC, you would have seen it. A column of men, tens of thousands of them, moving north along the Roman road with the patient, rhythmic efficiency of something that has already decided where it is going, dust rising in a long, pale trail behind them, the glint of iron catching the morning light, and at the front, on horseback, a lean figure in a red commander's cloak, the paludimentum, riding with the kind of forward-tilted posture that suggests a man who is always, in his mind, already at the destination. Julius Caesar had arrived in his province. What happened next, over the following 8 years, would become one of the most studied and debated military campaigns in human history. Not merely because of its scale, though the scale was staggering, but because of the quality of mind that directed it. Caesar in Gaul was not simply a Roman general doing what Roman generals did. He was something genuinely new, a commander who synthesized political intelligence, logistical brilliance, personal courage, and a willingness to improvise at speed, in the field, under conditions that would have paralyzed more conventional men. He learned his craft in real time, in the most demanding classroom imaginable, and he learned it so quickly and so thoroughly that within a few seasons, his own officers began to speak of him in terms that Romans normally reserved for legends. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because the first thing to understand about Caesar in Gaul is that he did not arrive with a plan for conquest. He arrived with a crisis, the Helvetii, A Celtic confederation of tribes from the region that is today Switzerland were on the move. Roughly 360,000 people, by Caesar's own account, including their families, their cattle, their belongings, the full portable weight of an entire civilization in motion. They were migrating westward through Roman allied territory toward the Atlantic coast of Gaul, driven by pressure from Germanic tribes pushing in from the east. Their movement was not, in itself, an act of war, but it threatened Roman interests, threatened Roman allies, and, most importantly for Caesar's purposes, it provided a justification for military action that even his enemies in Rome would struggle to publicly oppose. He moved with a speed that the Helvetii had not expected from a Roman commander. Within days of learning of their intended route, he had destroyed the bridge over the Rhone at Geneva, constructed 19 miles of fortification along the river's southern bank, 19 miles, built in extraordinary time by Roman legionary engineers who were among the most practically skilled men in the ancient world, and positioned his forces to make the crossing impossible. The Helvetii were forced to negotiate. Caesar refused their terms. They turned north into the territory of Rome's Gallic allies, and Caesar followed. The campaign that followed was swift and brutal and decisive. Caesar caught the Helvetii at the Battle of Bibracte, a punishing engagement in which the tribal mass came close, genuinely close, to breaking the Roman lines, close enough that Caesar later described the moment with the careful, deflating prose of a man who had experienced genuine fear and chosen to present it as a tactical variable rather than a human one. But the line held, and then it advanced, and by the end of the battle, the Helvetii had been shattered, sent back, diminished and exhausted, to their Swiss plateau, where they would remain for the rest of Caesar's lifetime. One campaign, one season, and Caesar had already demonstrated something that Gaul would spend the next 7 years trying and failing to disprove: that Roman discipline and Roman engineering, directed by a sufficiently intelligent mind, could defeat forces that outnumbered them by extraordinary ratios. The key was always the same: never allow the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement, move faster than they expected, build more than they thought possible, strike before they were ready, and rest only when resting served the larger purpose. He spent almost no time resting. The following years unfolded with the relentless momentum of a river after heavy rain. Each campaign season brought new crises and new opportunities, and Caesar, who had the historian's instinct as well as the general's eye, was writing it all down, composing his Commentarii de Bello Gallico in a spare third-person prose that presented his decisions as self-evidently correct, and his victories as the natural consequence of Roman virtue applied to Roman strategy. The Commentarii are, among many other things, one of the most elegant acts of political self-presentation in the ancient world. He was fighting the wars and simultaneously writing the narrative of the wars, shaping in real time how Rome would understand what he was doing and why. Every dispatch that went south to the city was not merely a military report, it was a chapter in the story he was telling about himself. And the story was extraordinary. In 57 BC, he turned northeast and broke the Belgic coalition, the tribes of what is now Belgium and northern France, in a series of engagements that displayed a tactical flexibility that his own officers found startling. The Belgae were formidable, arguably the finest warriors in all of Gaul, fierce and organized in a way that distinguished them from the looser tribal confederations of the south. Caesar defeated them anyway, adjusting his approach engagement by engagement, using the Roman fort not just as a defensive structure, but as an offensive tool. Building camps so quickly and so solidly in enemy territory that the psychological effect on the opposing tribes was itself a form of warfare. You could not burn a Roman camp the way you burned a village. You could not outrun it. It simply appeared, fully formed, geometrically precise, behind your lines, and suddenly you were no longer on the offensive. In 55 BC, He did something that had no military precedent and no particular military necessity. Something that was pure theater, staged for the audience in Rome as much as for the peoples of the north. He built a bridge across the Rhine. The Rhine was not a river that armies crossed. It was, in Roman thinking, the edge of the known world, the boundary beyond which lay the Germanic tribes, the deep forests, the darkness of the unconquered north. To cross it was symbolically enormous. Caesar built his bridge in 10 days. 10 days across one of the great rivers of Europe, using timber and engineering and the organized labor of legionaries who had learned under Caesar's command to treat the impossible as merely a logistical problem requiring sufficient organization. He crossed, spent 18 days demonstrating Roman military capacity to the Germanic tribes on the other bank, and then withdrew, not because he was driven out, but because he had accomplished what he came to accomplish. He had shown that the Rhine was not a boundary, that Rome, in the person of Julius Caesar, could go wherever it chose. Then he turned his fleet toward Britain. The British expeditions of 55 and 54 BC are fascinating precisely because they were, by the standards of Caesar's other campaigns, inconclusive. He crossed the Channel twice, the first time with a relatively small force, the second time with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, fought the native tribes, accepted their theoretical submission, and withdrew both times before winter closed the Channel behind him. He brought back no territory, no permanent occupation, no substantial plunder. By the metrics that Rome used to measure military success, the British campaigns were modest at best, and yet they were among the most resonant things he ever did. Britain, the island at the edge of the world, the place that lay beyond the ocean. And the Romans regarded the ocean with a reverence that was close to awe, as the final boundary of the human world, the place where the land ran out, and something immeasurably vast and uncertain began. To have crossed it, to have stood on British soil and fought there and returned. That image, distributed through the dispatches that arrived in Rome with Caesar's careful framing applied to them, was worth more than a dozen conventional victories. It made him mythological in the eyes of the Roman public, in a way that military competence alone could never have achieved. The Senate voted 20 days of public thanksgiving for the British campaigns. 20 days, the most extravagant celebration of a military achievement in Roman history. Cicero wrote to his friend Atticus with a mixture of admiration and political alarm that captures perfectly the mood in Rome at the time. The victories were real. The man was becoming something that the Republic had not designed itself to contain. But Gaul was not finished with Caesar, and in 52 BC, it produced the greatest challenge of his military career, a challenge that came closer than anything else to breaking him, and that revealed, under genuine pressure, the precise quality of the man that all those years of preparation and campaign had made. His name was Vercingetorix. He was young, probably in his late 20s, the chieftain of the Arverni tribe of central Gaul, and he was something Rome had not yet encountered in 8 years of Gallic campaigning, a unifying political intelligence, where previous Gallic leaders had fought Caesar tribe by tribe, alliance by fractured alliance. Vercingetorix understood that the only way to defeat Rome was to deny it what it needed most, not in pitched battle. The Gauls had learned, expensively, that pitched battle against Roman discipline was a losing proposition. No, Vercingetorix chose a different strategy entirely. He would deny Caesar food, scorched earth. Systematic, deliberate, heartbreaking scorched earth. Town after Gallic town burned by its own inhabitants before Caesar could reach them. Granaries, farms, stores of winter food, all of it turned to ash, so that the Roman legions, those extraordinary, unstoppable machines of organized violence, would have nothing to eat. An army that cannot eat, cannot fight. An army that cannot fight becomes, very quickly, a catastrophe. Caesar's response to this strategy revealed everything about how he had changed in 8 years of command. The man who had ridden north from Rome as an untested general, brilliant in theory, unproven in the field, that man was gone. In his place was something harder and stranger, a commander who had absorbed the psychology of crisis so completely that crisis had become his natural environment. He moved with terrifying speed through the Gallic winter, collecting supplies before Vercingetorix could burn them, running his legions at a pace that the Gauls had not believed Romans could sustain in the cold. He made decisions in hours that other commanders would have spent days debating, and he made them correctly. Not always, but with a frequency that suggested something beyond training or experience, a kind of deep, practiced intuition that is the final product of 10,000 hours of difficult thought. The climax came at Alesia, a Gallic hilltop stronghold in what is now Burgundy, where Vercingetorix had retreated with his forces after a battlefield reversal, expecting to hold out until a Gallic relief army arrived. Caesar did something that military historians still discuss, with something approaching reverence. He surrounded Alesia with 2 sets of fortifications simultaneously, an inner ring to contain the garrison, 11 miles of walls, towers, and ditches facing inward toward the town, and an outer ring, 14 miles of similar fortifications facing outward to contain the relief army when it arrived. He was besieging a town and preparing for a siege of his own, at the same time, with the same men, building on 2 front lines simultaneously in hostile territory, while Gallic forces prowled the surrounding hills. The psychological weight of that decision, to commit everything, to dig in and build, rather than to maneuver and retreat, required a quality that is related to courage but is not quite the same thing. It required certainty. Not the brittle certainty of a man who cannot imagine failure, but the deep-rooted certainty of a man who has imagined failure completely, has sat with it in the dark, and has decided to proceed anyway. The relief army arrived, hundreds of thousands of them by Caesar's account. The battle that followed was one of the most complex and desperate engagements in ancient military history. Caesar's legions fighting simultaneously inward against Vercingetorix's sorties and outward against the relief force, stretched thin across miles of fortification, plugging breaches with whatever troops could be spared. Caesar himself visible on horseback throughout, moving to wherever the line was weakest, his red cloak a signal to his officers of where the commander was and therefore where the crisis was. The relief army broke. Vercingetorix, understanding that it was over, rode out of Alesia the following day in his finest armor, circled Caesar's tribunal in silence, and dismounted at Caesar's feet. He sat there and waited to be taken. Caesar accepted the surrender without visible emotion. At the great chieftain bound and taken into custody, and turned to the administrative business of organizing what the battle had just produced. The conquest of Gaul was, for all practical purposes, complete. 8 years. 8 seasons of campaign across a territory the size of modern France. Roughly 300 tribes engaged, approximately 800 towns taken, Caesar's own figures, which even his critics rarely challenged substantially, recorded over 1 million Gauls killed and another 1 million enslaved, numbers so enormous that they sit heavily in the mind, as they should, as a reminder that the story of Julius Caesar is not only the story of a remarkable man, it is also the story of what remarkable men, given sufficient power and sufficient distance from accountability, are capable of doing to people who had the misfortune to stand between them and their ambition. He had set out to win a war. He had transformed a continent, and in doing so, he had created something that Rome had spent 5 centuries trying to prevent. He had created a general with an undefeated army that loved him personally, completely and without reservation, an army that had followed him across rivers and into forests and up onto fortified hills and through winters that were not supposed to be survivable. an army that had watched him make decisions under pressure that saved their lives again and again, and had drawn from that record the only conclusion that men in the field ever ultimately draw about a commander who keeps them alive, that he was worth following anywhere, including, if it came to it, south, including back to Rome. While Caesar was building bridges across the Rhine and walls around hilltop fortresses in the heart of Gaul, Rome was coming apart. It does not happen all at once, the unraveling of a political order. It happens the way a rope frays, one fiber at a time, each small separation barely visible on its own, until one morning you look at what you thought was a strong and serviceable thing, and realize that almost nothing is holding it together anymore. The republic that Caesar had left behind when he rode north in 58 BC had been strained and imperfect, but functional. The Rome he would return to a decade later was something else entirely. A city in which the old rules were observed in form and abandoned in practice, where political violence had become commonplace, where the streets were controlled by armed gangs loyal to rival factions, and where the Senate sat in its ancient chamber and passed resolutions that it no longer had the power to enforce. The triumvirate, that private agreement between three men that had seemed so solid in 60 BC, had been quietly rotting from within for years. Crassus was the first to go. In 53 BC, consumed by a military ambition that his wealth could fund, but his abilities could not justify, he led 7 Roman legions east against the Parthian Empire, the great power that controlled what is today Iran and Iraq, and walked into a catastrophe at the Battle of Carrhae that remains, 2,000 years later, one of the most complete military disasters in Roman history. The Parthian cavalry surrounded his infantry on an open plain and simply destroyed them with arrows, wave after relentless wave, from distances at which the Romans could not effectively respond. Crassus himself was killed, either during a botched negotiation or in the final collapse of his forces. The ancient sources disagree, and with him died the financial and political ballast that had kept the arrangement between Caesar and Pompey from tipping into open hostility. The man who had been the center of gravity between them was gone, and without that center, the two men who remained began, slowly and then with increasing speed, to drift toward a confrontation that both had probably always known was coming. Pompey, in Rome, had been moving closer to the Senate, not out of genuine affection for that institution. Pompey had his own complicated history with the Senate's obstructions, but out of the pragmatic recognition that if the balance of power in Rome was about to shift, the Senate was the vehicle through which a man in his position could most effectively shape that shift. He had remarried after the death of his wife Julia, Caesar's daughter, whose gentle presence had done more than any political agreement to keep the peace between the two men. Julia had died in childbirth in 54 BC, and with her went the last human thread connecting the two most powerful Romans alive. Pompey's new wife came from the conservative senatorial faction. The symbolism was not subtle. In the streets of Rome, meanwhile, a figure named Publius Clodius Pulcher had been running what amounted to a private army through the popular neighborhoods, mobilizing the urban poor in ways that were genuinely democratic in energy and frequently violent in expression. His rival, Titus Annius Milo, ran his own gangs in opposition. The two of them turned Rome's public spaces into contested territory, and in 52 BC, their confrontations escalated to the point where Clodius was killed on the Appian Way in a roadside brawl with Milo's men. His supporters carried his body into the Senate chamber and burned it there, and the Senate house burned with it, the ancient building reduced to ash in a fire started by a grieving mob who had nothing left to express their grief with except flame. The Senate, sitting in emergency session in the ruins of its own dignity, did something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. It appointed Pompey as sole consul, not dictator. That word still carried too much of Sulla's shadow to be politically usable, but sole consul, which was effectively the same thing under a more palatable name. One man, running Rome with the Senate's blessing. The Republic was performing its own autopsy and calling it a medical procedure. It was in this climate, this atmosphere of institutional collapse and barely contained military tension, that the question of Caesar's future began to move toward its crisis point. The legal architecture of the problem was precise, even if its implications were enormous. Caesar's command in Gaul was scheduled to expire. When it expired, he would become a private citizen again, and as a private citizen, he would be immediately vulnerable to prosecution. His enemies in the Senate, and there were many of them, had been quietly assembling a case against him for years, cataloguing the constitutional violations of his consulship in 59 BC, the legal grey areas of his Gallic campaigns, the financial irregularities that inevitably accumulated over a decade of provincial command. They did not necessarily expect to convict him. They expected to destroy him, to tie him up in courts and investigations long enough to neutralize him politically, to reduce him from the returning conqueror of Gaul to a defendant in a Roman courtroom, which was a rather different thing. Caesar's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He would not return as a private citizen. He would run for the consulship from his province, in absentia, legally permitted under an arrangement that had been specifically negotiated for him years before. If he could transition directly from his military command to the consulship, there would be no gap, no moment of legal vulnerability, no window through which his enemies could insert their prosecutions. He would step from the general's tent directly into the consul's chair, untouchable. The Senate, led by the men who wanted him prosecuted, refused. They passed resolutions demanding that Caesar lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen before any discussion of his candidacy could proceed. Caesar's tribunes in Rome, Mark Antony among them, vetoed the resolutions. The Senate declared the vetoes invalid. The tribunes fled Rome, dressed as slaves, and made their way north to Caesar's camp, arriving with the news that the constitutional order had, depending on how you chose to read it, either just protected itself or just destroyed itself. Caesar received them at Ravenna. He listened. He said very little, which was unusual enough in itself to be noted by those present. He had dinner. He attended to some business in the town, and then, late in the evening of January 10th in the year 49 BC, he gave quiet orders to a single legion, the 13th, to prepare to march. The Rubicon was not an impressive river. That is perhaps the first thing to understand about the crossing that would become the most famous moment in Caesar's life, the moment that gave the Western world one of its most durable phrases. It was a small river, shallow, narrow, unremarkable in every geographical sense, the kind of river that a traveler might cross without particularly noting it in a diary. What made it significant was entirely legal. The Rubicon marked the boundary of Caesar's province. It marked the point at which Roman law prohibited a general from bringing his army into Italian territory. Beyond that line, Caesar would not be a proconsul with a legitimate command. He would be a rebel, an invader, a man who had taken up arms against the Roman state. On the southern bank, he stopped. The ancient sources give us several accounts of what happened next, and they are worth holding gently rather than pressing too hard for precise historical fact, because what they preserve is something more valuable than fact. They preserve the emotional texture of the moment, as those who lived through it understood it. Suetonius tells us Caesar spent time in hesitation, that he discussed the implications with his officers in terms that acknowledged the full weight of what crossing meant, not just for himself, but for everyone. Plutarch suggests he spoke of the point of no return, of the suffering that would follow if he proceeded, that he understood with complete clarity that the world on the other side of that river would be different from the world on this side in ways that could not be undone. He crossed at night, quietly, with the 13th Legion, in the dark and cold of a January evening, through water that came up to the soldiers' knees. No ceremony, no speech to the assembled troops, no grand theatrical declaration, just a general and his men crossing a river, and the soft sound of water moving around their legs, and the world changing, he is said to have spoken as he reached the far bank. A phrase that has come down through the centuries with a dramatic clarity of the apocryphal, whether or not he actually said it. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. The game is in play. Whatever comes next, comes next. By morning, he was moving south, and the remarkable thing, the thing that tells you more about Caesar's 8 years in Gaul than any battle account could, was the speed of what followed. Town after Italian town opened its gates without resistance. The soldiers sent to hold them against Caesar's advance simply melted away or joined him outright. Pompey, who had assured the Senate that he had only to stamp his foot upon Italian soil to raise an army, found that his foot was not producing the desired effect. The veterans who were supposed to materialize were not materializing. The legions who were supposed to hold were not holding. He had overestimated his own legend and underestimated the depth of loyalty that a decade in the field produces in men who have watched their general make the right decision in the difficult moment more times than they can count. Pompey fled to Greece. The Senate fled with him. Caesar entered Rome without a battle, walked into the city that had tormented and celebrated and underestimated him his entire life, and found it, essentially, waiting. He did not execute anyone. He did not purge his enemies from their homes or post lists of the condemned in the forum. He had watched Sulla do those things when he was 15 years old, and he had drawn from that observation a conclusion that was both moral and strategic. That terror produces compliance but not loyalty, and that compliance without loyalty is a foundation that will eventually collapse beneath you. He practiced clemency. He released prisoners. He reassured the frightened city that he had not come to destroy the Republic, but to restore it to what it had been before his enemies had broken its mechanisms to use against him. Whether he believed that, by then, is a question that the historical record cannot cleanly answer. But Rome believed it, at least for now, at least long enough. There is something quietly extraordinary about watching a man get everything he ever wanted, not the explosive, champagne-drenched version of a rival that we tend to imagine for the ambitious, but the slower, stranger reality of it. The morning after, the ordinary light falling through the window onto a world that has been remade according to your vision, and the question that follows you from room to room, that sits at the edge of every decision, now what? Caesar was master of Rome, the civil war. That convulsion that had split the Roman world into two armed halves and sent senators fleeing to foreign shores, had run its course through Egypt and Africa and Spain, through battles won and alliances made, and the slow, grinding reduction of every military alternative to his rule. Pompey had been murdered on an Egyptian beach, betrayed by men who thought his death would please Caesar, and Caesar had wept when he was shown the head, genuinely wept by all accounts for a man he had spent years fighting, because Caesar understood that Pompey's death diminished something, that the world was smaller and less interesting without Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus in it, even as an enemy. He had gone to Egypt, and in Egypt he had met Cleopatra. The story of Caesar and Cleopatra is one that history has surrounded with so much romantic mythology that the political reality beneath it tends to get obscured. She was 21 when they met. He was 52. She was brilliant, polyglot, mathematically gifted, possessed of a political intelligence that had already, at her age, survived a palace coup and an exile and a civil war of her own. And she needed Caesar's military support to reclaim the Egyptian throne she shared, uneasily, with her younger brother. She presented herself to Caesar, famously, rolled in a carpet or a sack of laundry, smuggled past her brother's guards, delivered to the Roman general in his private quarters in Alexandria. Whether or not that precise detail is accurate, it captures something true about Cleopatra. Her willingness to take the audacious approach, to stake everything on a single bold move, to trust that her own intelligence and personality would do the rest of the work. They understood each other immediately. The relationship that followed was not simply personal. It produced a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra always insisted was Caesar's child. But it was also a genuine meeting of minds, two people who had each bent the world around their intelligence and found in the other someone who could fully appreciate the effort that required. Caesar stayed in Egypt longer than he should have, longer than the military situation strictly demanded, sailing up the Nile with Cleopatra on a royal barge in a journey that has the quality, even across 2,000 years of distance, of a man allowing himself a moment of simple pleasure in the middle of an extraordinary life. He had earned it. He took it. And then he returned to Rome and to the work of trying to govern a world he had conquered. The reforms he implemented in the years between his return and his death are, in their scope and their ambition and their extraordinary practicality, among the most impressive acts of statesmanship in ancient history. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, which he introduced with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, replacing the old Roman lunar calendar that had drifted so far from the actual seasons that it had become essentially fictional. The Julian calendar, with its 365 days and its leap year every fourth, was so fundamentally sound that it remained the basis of Western timekeeping for over 1,500 years, until the Gregorian reforms of 1582. And even then, the changes required were modest. A correction of 11 minutes per year that had accumulated across 16 centuries. Caesar gave us the shape of the year we still live inside. He extended Roman citizenship more broadly than it had ever been extended before, bringing in provincials from Gaul and Spain and beyond. A recognition that Rome was not a city-state anymore, but an empire, and that an empire cannot be governed by the narrow definition of who belongs to it. He reformed the Senate, expanding its membership and diluting the power of the old aristocratic families who had spent decades using its procedures as a weapon against reform. He planned vast public works, a new forum, a new road across the Apennines, a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. He was working on plans for a campaign against the Parthians, the Eastern Empire that had destroyed Crassus, that would settle the account Rome felt it owed. He was planning, in parallel, a drainage project for the Pontine marshes south of Rome that would reclaim hundreds of square miles of agricultural land. He was governing the way he had campaigned, constantly, in multiple directions at once, with an energy that left his subordinates breathless and that was beginning, by the winter of 45 BC, to unsettle even those who admired him most. Because the reforms, however practical and beneficial, were being implemented by a man who was not sharing power in any real sense, who was making decisions at a speed and on a scale that left the Senate no time to deliberate, debate, or do the thing that assemblies of men most need to do, which is feel that their presence matters. He had been named dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then in early 44 BC, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, for life. The office that Rome had created for genuine emergencies, intended always as a temporary measure, a last resort, had become Caesar's permanent title. He wore it without visible discomfort. He sat to receive the Senate when tradition demanded he stand. He accepted honors from the assembly, the right to wear the laurel wreath at all times, the purple robes of the ancient kings, a golden throne in the Senate chamber, with the relaxed ease of a man who had long since stopped performing humility because the performance had become transparently inadequate to the facts on the ground. And somewhere in the city, in the houses of men who had accepted his clemency and eaten his food and attended his games and received his pardons, a conversation was beginning. It was not one conversation, it was many, held separately, in private rooms, in careful language, among men who were feeling their way toward a shared conclusion and testing each other's commitment to it before saying anything that could not be unsaid. The men at the center of it were not, for the most part, the crude opportunists that history sometimes makes them. Marcus Junius Brutus was a man of genuine philosophical seriousness, a student of Stoic thought, possessed of a personal integrity that even Caesar, who had pardoned him after Pharsalus, despite his having fought for Pompey, who trusted him, who by some accounts was genuinely fond of him, acknowledged and respected. Gaius Cassius Longinus, Brutus's brother-in-law and the operational intelligence behind the conspiracy, was sharper and colder and more explicitly motivated by personal grievance, but not without his own conception of what Rome ought to be. What united them was not ambition, not primarily. What united them was an idea, old, inherited, woven into the foundational mythology of the Republic. That one-man rule was the ultimate crime against Roman civilization, that the word rex, king, were so poisonous in the Roman vocabulary, that any man who reached for the reality of kingship, regardless of what he called it, had placed himself outside the protection of Roman law, had made himself, in the technical term, a tyrant. And tyrant killing, in the Stoic tradition that Brutus had absorbed, was not murder. It was a civic act, a restoration. They called themselves the liberatores, the liberators. There were eventually 23 of them. They chose the Ides of March, the 15th, as the date, because the Senate was scheduled to meet, because Caesar would be there, and because within days he was due to leave Rome for the Parthian campaign, after which he would be beyond their reach for years. They kept the secret with a discipline that is itself remarkable. 23 men, in a city where secrets had a notoriously short lifespan, holding this one for weeks. Caesar had been warned, multiple times, through multiple channels, in the days and hours before the Ides. A soothsayer had told him to beware the date. His wife, Calpurnia, had dreamed badly and begged him not to go to the Senate that morning. A written warning had been pressed into his hand as he walked to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting temporarily while the Senate House was being rebuilt after the fire. He kept the note, unread, in his hand. He never opened it, whether he knew and proceeded anyway, whether he was simply too confident in his clemency to believe that those he had spared would truly raise a blade against him, or whether the accumulated fatigue of a life lived at that extraordinary pitch had produced something like indifference to consequence. The ancient sources offer different suggestions, and the truth may be some combination of all of them. He was not a young man. He had epilepsy, which had been worsening in his final years. He had lived with danger so intimately and for so long that perhaps its texture had become simply the texture of life, indistinguishable from everything else. He entered the chamber. The Senate rose, as was custom. One of the conspirators approached him, supposedly to petition on behalf of a brother in exile, and took hold of his toga. The gesture was the signal. The blades came out. 23 men, 23 wounds. The accounts of what he did in those first seconds, whether he fought back, whether he called out, whether he pulled his toga over his face at the end, for the sake of dignity, vary in their details with the particular slant of each historian who recorded them. What the post-mortem examination determined, according to the physician Antistius who conducted it, was that of the 23 wounds, only one had been fatal. A single wound to the chest. The others were superficial, the frantic, overlapping strikes of men who were terrified and committed in equal measure, crowding each other in the confined space, some of them accidentally wounding one another in the confusion. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. That detail. And history is full of details that feel too precisely arranged to be accidental, and yet are. has never stopped being remarkable. At the feet of the man he had driven into exile and who had been murdered on an Egyptian shore. As though the story had a stage manager, the conspirators had planned the killing with some care and planned almost nothing that came after it. They had assumed, with the particular optimism of men who have convinced themselves that their cause is self-evidently just, that Rome would greet Caesar's death as a liberation, that the people would understand, would ratify the act with their approval, that the Republic would simply resume, like a piece of music that had been interrupted and now found its place again. The people of Rome did not respond that way. They responded with grief and then with fury, and the fury was the kind that does not cool quickly. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, delivered the funeral oration in the Forum with a genius for emotional manipulation that Shakespeare would later immortalize. And the crowd that listened to it went from mourning to rage in the space of an afternoon. The conspirators fled the city. The reading of Caesar's will, in which he left his gardens to the Roman people and a personal gift of money to every citizen in the city, produced a wave of popular feeling that the liberatores had never anticipated and could not have survived even if they had stayed to face it. Civil war returned. Antony, and then Octavian, Caesar's young great-nephew and adopted heir, a 19-year-old who would reveal himself over the following years to be one of the most coldly brilliant political operators in all of Roman history, hunted the conspirators across the Mediterranean world. Brutus and Cassius both died at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, 2 years after the Ides. The Republic, whose restoration they had given everything to achieve, died with them. Octavian would eventually stand alone as the first Roman emperor, taking the title Augustus, and would rule for over 40 years, building on the foundations that Caesar had laid, using the political vocabulary that Caesar had invented, governing an empire that Caesar's campaigns had expanded and Caesar's reforms had begun to organize. He would place Caesar among the gods. He would call himself Caesar's son. And the word Caesar, that word, would migrate outward into the languages of the world, becoming title after title, century after century, in civilizations that had never heard of the Rubicon or Alasia or the Ides of March. What do we make of him, finally? What does the full shape of Julius Caesar's life amount to when we step back and try to see it whole? He was a man of extraordinary gifts deployed in the service of extraordinary ambition, and the combination produced results that were extraordinary in every sense of that word, meaning they went beyond what is ordinary, beyond what the normal boundaries of a single human life ought to be able to contain, but also meaning they produced suffering on a scale that the word extraordinary cannot adequately honor or condemn. 1 million people killed in Gaul. Entire Celtic civilizations disrupted and absorbed and permanently altered. A republic dismantled, not cleanly, not simply, but dismantled nonetheless. Its 5 centuries of shared governance ended by a man who had grown too large for its mechanisms to hold. And yet, the calendar we follow, the months named July for him and August for his heir, the very concept of a centralized, administratively coherent empire governing diverse peoples under common law, the idea that great writing and great action are not separate vocations but can, in the right person, be expressions of the same intelligence, the demonstration that a single human being, starting without great wealth, navigating genuine danger and genuine poverty and genuine political exclusion, could, through intelligence and will and an absolute refusal to accept the ceiling that circumstance tried to place on him, reshape the world. These things came from Julius Caesar, came from that particular Roman, that particular life, those particular choices made in the particular dark of a January night beside a shallow river. He stood on the bank for a long time, and then he crossed.